Oh my God, let me tell you something. Your car is shot, the muffler bearings are missing, your blinker fluid is empty, and don't even let me get you started on the decompartmentalizer of the flicker flagger. It's gonna be $1,000. What do you say? Would you trust your car mechanic if he talked to you in that ambiguous language? Probably not. But you know what the sad thing is? Is that car mechanics are notorious for speaking in crazy terms that they know their customers are never going to understand because they know something we don't know. We're going to take them at face value. Well, guess what, folks? That's exactly what this speech is all about. It's about questioning phrases and quotes that people have just assumed are true for years. But the reality is, just like car mechanics, guess what? Proverbs and quotations may not always be truthful. So our job is to really question whether or not these famous quotes that we've hold dearly in our heart, or these proverbs that we've always taken for granted or taken for face value, are actually true. And we're going to learn to argue whether or not, based on our interpretation, these things could actually be trustworthy, just like our car mechanic. And that's why I'm dressed up as Al, the car mechanic for Ford. All right, so let's talk about this for a second. Before you dig into this video, I really encourage you to go to page 14 and 15 in your course pack and look at the Q&A section regarding this speech. If you really don't understand what the speech is about, it's probably going to be hard to interpret this video, so at least look at that. And if you're still confused, you can look at the example outline so you kind of have a better idea of what's going on. I'm going to be talking specifically about the takeaway and main point in this speech. These are two huge ideas that we're going to use in pretty much every speech in this class. And so it's really important that you pay close attention and take good notes. All right, so let's get started. In this speech, what is the difference between a takeaway and a main point? Well, your takeaway at the most basic level is your interpretation in layman's or simple terms what your proverb or quote actually means. Now, I want to be clear about something, and you should write this down. However you want to interpret your proverb or quote is totally up to you. There are no wrong interpretations. There are only clearer interpretations and less clear interpretations. Sound good? All right, your main point is the specific area in life, whether your interpretation is true or false in, okay? So takeaway, very broad. Main point, very specific, okay? Now we're gonna dig deeper into both of these in just a minute, but I wanna make sure you understand this. Your takeaway is the interpretation of your proverb or quote, your interpretation in a simple way. The main point is the specific area in life whether it's true or false. So let's use a quote from Henry Ford. This is my favorite. Whether you think you can or you can't, you're probably right. That's really easy to just agree with and say, oh yeah, self-fulfilling prophecy. That makes perfect sense. But what I want you to do is really dive in and say, hey, what's Henry Ford really saying? Well, I think Henry Ford is saying that there's a lot of power in there's a lot of power in how much you believe in yourself. And your chances of success are probably going to be based heavily on how much you believe in yourself. How is that for a pretty simple and concise interpretation of it? So now my main point would be the area in life this is true in. Well, guess what? I'm an educator, so you know the main area in life I'm going to choose is education. There's a whole bunch of research about mindsets and what you believe about yourself as a student. And they found that your beliefs alone about how smart you are play a huge role in how well you do. But I'll talk about that in class, hopefully. The point is that your takeaway, very broad, it's just an interpretation. Main point is very specific in terms of what area this is true or false in. Now, if you wanted to, and I encourage you to, you could argue and say Henry Ford was wrong. Belief in yourself has nothing to do with your success. Or if you like Old Spice, belief in your smelf. Hopefully you're laughing. I don't know. I paused. I don't know if you're laughing. Let me know. All right, so let's move on to question number 2. If you're still confused, bring those questions to class and we'll talk about that. All right, 3 best practices for creating a takeaway for speech 1. Well, guess what? Number 1, it has to be in one complete sentence. It cannot be a question. Because here's the thing, right? You need to answer the question as to whether or not these proverbs or these quotes that you're going to talk about are true or false. So make sure it is one complete sentence. And if you don't know what a complete sentence is, then Google it, because it cannot be like a segmented statement. It can't be a question, any of those things. One complete sentence. And this is the truth for all takeaways in this class, for every speech. Number 2, in your takeaway, you have to eliminate all confusion. Okay? As I said earlier, you can't be a car mechanic. You got to put it in simple layman's terms. Again, let's talk about the word layman's. Layman's is an overused word. It simply means like a layman, someone who has just a very simple like construction job. And it's kind of rude, isn't it, to say that like, oh, it's layman's term, something the layman would understand, someone who has no education. But what I'm saying is just put it in simple terms that everyone can pick it up and say, oh, right, this makes sense. This is going to be challenging. You might have to write your takeaway multiple times and check it with your roommates. Last but not least, number 3, no ambitious language, okay? You can't use catchphrases and the generic sayings that go overlooked. Like, it is what it is. You really need to be specific in your takeaway in terms of how you're interpreting this. And you want everyone to be able to say, oh, right, okay, I'm totally with you. Boom, okay? So that's for your takeaway. Now, let's talk about the best practices for your main point. Just like your takeaway, it's got to be one complete sentence. It can't be a question or a segmented sentence or anything like that, okay? Again, the reason why is because it's got to be concise, and of course, it has to be clear. And the easiest way to get both of those is to be one complete sentence. All right. Next, the main point has to focus on one specific area of life, okay? Here are some options: sports, careers, relationships, school, or something I've never heard of before. If you're not sure that you can find a specific area of life for your proverb or quote, you have 2 options, okay? You can change your interpretation, or 2, you can just find a new one. The best piece of advice I can give students is to have multiple quotes and or proverbs and multiple interpretations to kind of decide, okay, well, where am I going to find the most research? Because you're going to need 4 sources for this speech. So if you can't find enough sources that are going to argue whether or not one specific area of life to argue whether or not this is true in one specific area in life, then you might need to either change the area of life, or you might need to change the proverb or quote or the interpretation. All right, last but not least, this is just as important as the last thing I said. It has to argue whether the interpretation or proverb or quote is true or false. It cannot be one or the other. It can't be true and false, okay? So one of my favorite speeches of all time, believe it or not, was the famous Shakespeare quote, "Absence makes the heart grow fonder." You know what my student argued? No, that's actually not true. In relationships, absence sometimes makes the eye wander. And so the main area of life was relationships. But basically the general idea was that, absence actually doesn't make the heart grow fonder. So what was really interesting about that is they interpret this as being false. So I really encourage you to really question these often overlooked and just quickly accepted terms. You know, like my favorite is the grass is always greener on the other side, because it's like, well, that's not always true. Sometimes we get new opportunities and we take them, and we're like, wow, this was much better. But in some cases, yeah, we forget that, it's all our attitude, and it's not necessarily our situation in life. All right, so here's what I want to do as I end the speech. I want to give you 2 things to think about. Obviously, you have an action step on the next page. So let's talk about that. You need to find a proverb or quote that you believe you're going to use for your speech. I want you to interpret what you think it means in very simple terms. That's your takeaway. And then 2, find a specific area of life you think is true or false in, and write the main point for that. If you don't know how to do that, look at the outline examples at the end of this unit, so you can see how they have done it before. There's a good example, and there's a bad example, and there's comments and all sorts of things. I would also encourage you to kind of just start Googling it, even though that's going to be the next step. For your next prep, you can start now, just so that way you don't fall in love with the proverb or quote and then realize there's no research for it. Okay, so that's the first part. The other thing I was going to say is have fun with this. Okay, a lot of people always ask me, Adam, why am I doing this speech? And I've tried to showcase in this video. This speech is about questioning what we take for granted and saying, you know what, is what you're saying true? But even more important, is what you're saying clear? Does it even make sense? I want to make you clear communicators. Don't be like a car mechanic who's going to take advantage of the fact that you're not going to question things. Instead, be a critical thinker. Take the time to say, you know what, this is, I'm not going to take this for granted. I'm going to look deeply into this and try to understand it. All right, I'm getting out of this car mechanic suit. It is hot. Holy cow. And make sure you find a good car mechanic. Don't get taken advantage of. All right, Seacrest out. How long was